After all the events of the past few years, Dublin today is a city in shock. Like the rest of Ireland, it's reeling from the worst economic crisis of modern times, and yet it retains its international appeal. Foreign visitors still flock here in their thousands, attracted by the fine Georgian architecture, as well as the legendary crack. I'm Brian Murray. I was born and bred in Dublin, and I'm as proud as any other Dub of the gorgeous masque the city shows the world. But there's another Dublin that interests me more, one that hardly any foreigners and not many Irish people know anything about. To experience this hidden city, you need to head for one of Dublin's most famous landmarks, the King's Inns on the north bank of the Liffey. It's a magnificent 18th century building, the setting of many a costume drama, but it's not the place I want you to see. Our real destination lies nearby. It's a bruised and battered but utterly fascinating Georgian terrace, and it goes by the name of Henrietta Street.
Henrietta Street is the oldest Georgian terrace in Dublin. It's also one of the most interesting. In the 1730s, when they were being erected, these towering four-story buildings were the elegant homes of bishops and earls. But by the mid-19th century, this neighborhood, like similar ones across the city, underwent a dramatic change. The rich moved out, and the poor moved in. Almost overnight, this area became what it was destined to remain for over 100 years, a small part of a vast network of grossly overcrowded, substandard housing, one of the largest and most enduring slums Europe has ever seen.
Four-story tenement houses like the ones in Henrietta Street dominated the Dublin skyline for more than 100 years. Thousands of people who live or work in the city today are descended from the occupants of those houses. A little over 30 years ago now, I discovered that I'm one of them.
In 1979, I landed a leading role in the TV adaptation of Strumpet City, James Plunkett's famous novel about life in the Dublin Tenements 100 years ago. Much of the series was filmed right here on Henrietta Street. And I remember telling my Aunt May one time where I was filming, and she casually told me that herself, her elder sister Rosie, my mum, and their mum lived right here when they were girls. It was the first hint I'd had that tenements were part of my background too.
I'll be the first scab that fell in the Liffey on his way to work.
Hey, Pat, go easy.
What's up with you?
Hennessy's no scab. He's a harmless poor bugger with a family to feed.
Strumpet City was the making of me as an actor. I'm very fond of the series and proud of it too, but making it left me with some unanswered questions. Why had my mother never talked to me about Henrietta Street? Was there a stigma attached to coming from the tenements, and if so, was that stigma justified? What, in a nutshell, was tenement life really like? In this series, we're going to find out. We're going to be hearing from a host of former tenement dwellers and from knowledgeable writers and historians. They'll be casting a vivid light on the long and shocking history of the Dublin slums.
They were dying like flies. It was unbelievable. Galloping consumption was called.
Dublin's poor were really living in third world conditions.
You have people writing as late as 1934, 35, 36 about nakedness. Literally about not having enough clothes to leave the house.
I remember one time I ate a cut of bread off the ground. I was that hungry.
It's not just a case of they don't have money to buy food, it's they've nowhere to go to the toilet. It's like they've been treated like dogs, really. We'll also have the benefit of observations and experiences of a very special group of Dubliners. 7 people who have strong links with Henrietta Street in general, and number 7, the house behind me, in particular.
The people in question are all members of the Winston family, a Dublin-based clan with offshoots all over Ireland and indeed the world. They've come together tonight in the clubhouse of a North Dublin Gaelic football team to celebrate the 21st birthday of one of their relatives. Providing the music is a local rock band, fronted by another member of the family, music mad Don Elliott Baker. He's in rock star mode tonight. Before long, though, he'll be performing a very different kind of role. Along with 6 of his relatives, he's going to be spending a long weekend inside number 7 Henrietta Street, coping as best he can with the harsh living conditions that thousands of Dubliners had to put up with in the past. Seven Henrietta Street was a typically overcrowded tenement house for the best part of 100 years, and the impact of that history is obvious today. When you look around the house nowadays, you can't miss the telltale signs of occupancy by wave after wave of hard-pressed people. Some things have improved here over the years, of course. The rooms that once housed impoverished tenants are artists' studios nowadays, and the noise and overcrowding of the tenement years are long gone. But this remains a tough building in which to live. The house does have electricity these days, but there's no central heating and the amenities on offer are basic, to say the least. There are no proper kitchens, for instance, just tiny washing up areas with cold water only, no hot. And there aren't any bathrooms either, just cramped lavatories like this. Luxurious isn't the word that comes to mind.
Most people wouldn't want to spend 3 hours here, let alone 3 days. But the Winstons aren't most people. We've established that their link with Henrietta Street goes all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. At the time of the 1911 census, Sarah O'Neill, the paternal grandmother to some of those who'd be coming here soon, and great-grandmother to the rest of them, lived next door in number 8 Henrietta Street. Some time later, she and the man she met and married in the meantime, a blind brushmaker named Edward Winston, moved into this house and stayed here for the rest of their lives. As a matter of fact, some of their descendants actually lived here until 1972, and that includes some of our volunteers.
But even those who lived here till then won't find it easy coming back. They're going to be spending 3 days and 2 nights cooped up together in this small room, one of 2 such rooms the family occupied years ago. They'll have no access to a bathroom, no heating other than a coal fire, and nothing to cook on, apart from this ancient range. Most of us would be horrified by this prospect, but not our volunteers. Don Elliott, for one, is positively looking forward to the whole thing.
I am, yeah. It's just an experience, something different. Going back in time, pretty much. See what life was like for my mum and my uncles.
The older members of the group are looking forward to the weekend too, for reasons of their own.
For me, I spent my first 16 years there, so it's something I've always thought about, I'd love to do, go back into the house and just see where it was that we came from.
I want to see if the ghosts are real. I want to see if they still there.
I know that I wanted to try and do things better for my children, and I'm just wondering, was that what my father's thoughts were? So, and I know he was brought up in Henrietta Street, and so I'm just wondering what it was like for him.
The family member who's most excited about going back to the past is laundrette owner Kathy Winston. She has fond memories of growing up in Henrietta Street during the 1960s, even though, like her brothers and sisters, she had things pretty tough at the time.
We weren't really that badly off, but you had a toilet at the end of the hall. That was your bathroom facilities. Your washing facilities was a tin bath that was filled every Saturday, and, you queued to get in. There was nowhere else to wash, you literally did everything in the one room,
This striking photograph shows Kathy standing outside 7 Henrietta Street on the day of a religious parade in 1969. Her mother Annie, who raised 14 children in the house, is sitting on the steps nearby. Annie is alive and well and, almost unbelievably, jiving at the age of 87. Finding out how she and her late husband James coped with life in Henrietta Street is one of the main reasons Kathy and the others have for wanting to go back.
We just think it's great to move back in and just to see what was it like for 2 of them and 14 children to live in that environment every day, day in and day out.
We'll be following the Winston family's return to Henrietta Street throughout the series, but that's not all we'll be doing. We'll also be exploring every twist and turn of the tenement story, and we're going to start by finding out what the slums were like 100 years ago. This building on Dublin's south side used to be Jacob's Biscuit Factory. Nowadays, though, it houses the National Archives of Ireland, an institution with which many people have become familiar in recent years. Along with millions of other documents, the archives contain the Irish census returns of 1911 and 1901. When these went online a few years ago, they turned the archives into an internet phenomenon.
When we put 1911 up first at the end of 2007, we did get phone calls from people saying, could you take that thing down? The entire staff of my office is spending the whole day browsing their street to see who lived there in 1911. Practically everyone I've ever met has gone on the census website. They're constantly telling me, taxi drivers telling me, guess what I found the other night?
I visited the website many times, but I've been keen for a while now to view certain documents in the flesh, so to speak. And now I've done just that. All these documents relate to Henrietta Street, and they make fascinating reading. The census enumerator's report on the street reveals that the 15 houses that were standing there at the time were occupied by a grand total of 835 people. That's an astonishing 55 people per house. But almost unbelievably, number 7, Henrietta Street, was even more crammed. These are census submission forms, which were submitted by the 19 families who lived in number 7 Henrietta Street at the time. And they bear the names of 104 men, women, and children. 104 people living in the same house. But the interesting thing is that not all of these people were desperately poor. In fact, a lot of the heads of households are down as holding down a skilled job. Here's an Edward Kennedy here, for example. He has his occupation down as iron molder. Now, iron molder was a pretty well-paying trade in 1911, so the Kennedys were doing pretty okay. Lots of other families, of course, were under a great deal more pressure. Here's James Gibson. Now, James Gibson is the head of the family here, Roman Catholic labourer. His wife, Anne, and 6 children. And they shared their obviously cramped 2-room tenement with an adult lodger, a Jeremiah Fletcher. He's there in the house with them because obviously they need some assistance to help pay their rent. The Gibson situation seems pretty desperate to us. But there's evidence that they were, in fact, markedly better off than many other people who were struggling to survive in the Dublin of 100 years ago.
The Dublin that we see in 1911 is really a city of great contrasts. There were beautiful sides to the city. Georgian Dublin was particularly impressive. That reflected an earlier era of some splendour, of some social standing, of some stature. And then, of course, you have the issue of the teeming poor, or the teeming tenements, and the idea of there being an extraordinary amount of poor people packed into tenement dwellings.
The 1911 census proves that around a third of the city's inhabitants were living in tenement houses at that time. And a remarkable collection of photographic slides, housed here in Merrion Square, reveals just how bad those houses were.
So, first of all, Christian, tell me about these photographs.
Well, these are all photographs that were taken shortly after the collapse of two houses in Church Street on the 2nd of September 1913. So just right when the lockout was occurring across Dublin, killing 7 people, and there was uproar in the city at the time. A lot of people were very concerned about the whole housing conditions around Dublin. What's unusual about this collection is the number of interior shots, which you don't tend to see. I suppose there's nothing pretty about these, so most photographers wouldn't have bothered taking this type of photograph. But here we see the reality of what the inside...
The wrought iron bedhead, look at it.
Yeah. But there seems to be a little child in the bed there.
Oh gosh, I think you're right.
I'm presuming that this little child is very sick, and that's the reason why she's there. And the very corner of the shot is what looks like her sister, perhaps, looking on.
God, and there's a fork and a spoon there, and the remains of... Is that a plate with some piece of bread in it or something? And look at the corner, I mean, look at the state of the room.
And here we see an example of the toilet facilities of the time, which is quite extraordinary. They were all outdoor toilets. But those 2 toilets, they were to accommodate 70 people, effectively, that lived in this particular house on Newmarket. But the comment at the time was also that, in fact, it was potentially open to anybody in the entire city to use, because they were open to the public, effectively. So the entire population, which was over 300,000 at the time, could have used this toilet.
So it wasn't your toilet, it was the toilet?
It was the toilet, and anybody could use it.
It's hard to imagine now that kind of poverty in the city, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just a case of they don't have money to buy food, it's they've nowhere to go to the toilet. It's like they've been treated like dogs, really. Right?
These photographs suggest that life in the Dublin slums of 100 years ago was almost unbelievably harsh. And that's an impression that historians and other experts confirm.
When you put the Dublin experience of poverty into some kind of international perspective, you can see that Dublin's poor were really living in third world conditions.
In a lot of tenement houses, you might have had a piggery in the back garden, you might have animals kept outside. Running water was an issue, proper sanitation was a serious issue. And you can see this from the health statistics. Mortality rates in Dublin were much higher than they were even in London.
When you look at the households in Henrietta Street, you really see what that means. Nearly every family records the loss of at least one child, some of them far more. So the Davis family, for example, Catherine Davis, who is, by the time of the 1911 census, is a widow. She recorded that she had 14 children, only 2 of whom were living in 1911. Many of the other families record having, say, 10, 11 children with 4 or 5 living. It just speaks of the conditions that people lived in that caused infant mortality and the hardship that certainly the mothers in those families would have had to deal with.
When you hear about the misery that existed in the Dublin tenements of the 1900s, all that hardship and poverty, death and disease, it's difficult to make any kind of a connection with the grandeur of places like Trinity College here. Yet most historians agree that if we want to understand why the Dublin tenements came into existence, we need to go back to that time when most of these wonderful buildings, and indeed most of Dublin's famous landmarks, were erected. The 18th century.
As the grandeur of Trinity College strongly implies, Dublin was a very different place in the 18th century from the depressed, slum-ridden city it became later on. George in Dublin possessed great buoyancy and vigour, qualities that stemmed from its role as a seat of government.
Ireland was a possession of the British Crown at the time, But the people who sat in the Irish Parliament House, the building here behind me and now obviously the Bank of Ireland, exercised real political power. This gave Dublin an air of glamour and confidence. Some people even called it the second city of the British Empire. But underneath, things were nowhere near as rosy or as stable as they seemed.
Although Dublin in the 18th century was the second city of the British Empire, certainly one of the top 10 cities in terms of size and wealth in all of Europe, it was still very much a divided city. The Irish Parliament was, it must be remembered, a Protestant parliament. Catholics got the right to vote in small numbers in 1793, but in a way the Protestant parliament was there to protect the interests of the exclusive Protestant ascendancy. 9/10 of the population were Catholic, and they were completely excluded from the political system. They would have felt completely marginalised, and again that feeds into the resentment that culminated then in the 1798 rebellion.
The rebellion was a brave but ill-fated attempt to throw off British rule. The rebels were heavily outnumbered, and the uprising was easily suppressed as a result. This was a major blow to Irish pride, and it was quickly followed by another, the passing by the British Parliament in London of an extremely significant piece of legislation, the Act of Union of 1801.
The Act of Union led to the closure of the Irish Parliament House. This room here, once the debating chamber of the House of Lords, is all that's left of its elegant interior. It also meant the introduction of direct rule from London. Now, as the Parliament was a severely compromised institution, you might be thinking that didn't matter much. But it did. The Act of Union had extremely powerful and long-lasting effects, especially on Dublin.
After the Act of Union, Dublin starts to sink. You have a flight of the aristocracy, of the bishops, of rich merchants out of the city, in some cases to London, obviously, because that's where the focus of Parliament shifts to. Once you don't have a Parliament in Dublin any longer, that changes the whole complexion of the city.
When that happened, the upper echelons of society moved back to London. With them, they took their demand for luxury goods and so on, and all of the services that required the very high quality craftsmanship and so on. That had been a feature of Dublin in the 18th century.
The exodus from the city of the rich and powerful sparked off an economic depression, which dragged on for much of the 19th century. But the Act of Union wasn't bad for everyone. As Anglo-Irish aristocrats abandoned the grand city centre houses, which they'd had built for themselves when times were good, other people, Catholics as well as Protestants, spotted an opportunity and grabbed it with both hands.
Suddenly then you see in the squares the more middle class people moving in, top barristers like Daniel O'Connell. So by the 1820s it's mainly merchants and other kinds of businessmen and lawyers and judges that are moving in.
The lucky purchasers of elegant houses like this must have been absolutely thrilled at the splendour and comfort of their new home, which of course in many cases they picked up at knockdown prices. Their fortunate descendants could probably still be occupying the houses they bought today if it wasn't for an unforeseen event. The catastrophic failure of the Irish potato crop in the mid-1840s and the subsequent onset of the Great Famine.
The outbreak of the Great Famine during the 1840s didn't only devastate the Irish countryside, it had a big effect on Dublin as well. Dispossessed people, no one knows how many, flocked into the city in the wake of the disaster. Their arrival made some of Dublin's existing inhabitants think again about where they wanted to live.
The members of Dublin's middle-class elite certainly didn't fancy the idea of sharing their inner city neighbourhoods with thousands of half-starved people. I mean, what's the point of having sweeping staircases and high-ceiling salons with the stench of poverty, not to mention disease, wafting through every window. We're not putting up with this, I can hear them say. We're off to the suburbs.
Dublin was bounded at that time by two 18th century canals, which still exist today. Just outside these waterways lay numerous newly formed settlements, to which the eyes of prosperous Dubliners were now increasingly drawn.
Outside the city proper, you have these burgeoning suburban townships, we call them. You have places like Rathmines and Rathgar, you've got the Pembroke Estate, the Ballsbridge area, you've got Drumcondra, you've got Clontarf. To the west of the city, you've got Inchicore, and they're very attractive places to live. So the wealthy are moving out without pause, really. There's a constant shift out of the wealthiest to the new suburban townships.
Dublin, meanwhile, was sinking fast. People whom we'd call property developers had realized by now that a great deal of money could be made by buying up houses that had been built for the very rich and subdividing them into meanly proportioned tenements aimed at the very poor. Whole areas were turned upside down in this way, and before long, the entire city was transformed.
It takes about 10 years for the individual streets in the North City to go from being aristocratic into slums. It's quite phenomenal, the speed at which subdivision happened. It was very much a downward spiral.
Well, already by 1879, 47% of the population, so almost half of the people in the city, were living in tenements. So we know that it was a very considerable proportion of the population. About 112,000 people were living in tenements at that stage. And the situation seemed to be getting worse. Practically no area of the city was without its tenements or without its slums.
Lots of property speculators and others jumped on the tenement bandwagon, but no one man did more to encourage the growth of the slums in Dublin than the man who once owned and occupied this enormous Victorian mansion. His name? Joseph Mead.
Michael Joseph Mead was born in Dublin in the 1830s. He took over his father's building firm, which was called Mead & Sons, in about 1866 and developed it into a very successful firm which ultimately employed 900 people. He served as Lord Mayor of Dublin in 1891 and again in 1892, after which he was appointed to the Privy Council. He appears to have been an incredibly popular politician. On the other hand, he is responsible for converting the houses in Henrietta Street into tenements.
Joseph Mead, Alderman Mead, as he liked to be known, bought 9 houses in Henrietta Street, including number 7, during the 1890s. He could have preserved them as they were, or divided them into respectable-sized dwellings, but he didn't. He carved them up instead, and crammed in as many people as he could.
It was a very deliberate decision. He ripped out the original 18th century staircases, the original fireplaces, and he sold them in London to make more money for himself. And then he divided up the rooms, sometimes into 3, so that each room, each partitioned room, could hold a family. And that really, I think, sets the seal on the horrible nature of Alderman Mead.
It's hard to view Joseph Mead in anything but a harsh light. He forced many hundreds of people to live in essentially rabbit hutches, all the time posing as a great friend of the poor, and made a fortune while doing so. When he died in 1900, the rent he derived from his Henrietta Street properties was revealed to be £1,500 a year. That's €160,000 in today's money.
Very few people gained as much from Dublin's housing crisis as Alderman Mead did, but a great many benefited to a lesser extent. And they didn't all fit the stereotype of a grasping Irish landlord.
Well, certainly there's been a myth kind of painted, I suppose, in more recent years that the owners and landlords of these houses were all of kind of Anglo-Irish descent, you know, the last vestiges of the aristocracy and so on. But in truth, most of the owners were, I suppose, middle-class professionals, doctors, lawyers, that type of thing.
Property was the pension for many families. So if you were a small businessman and you were able to purchase a property or develop a property yourself, this allowed for an additional income for you, but also for your wife, for your children, to support them in their education, particularly if something happened to you if you died.
People today might be less inclined to condemn the slum landlords of 100 years ago if it could be shown that they treated their tenants with basic respect. The example of Henrietta Street strongly suggests, however, that they didn't.
There certainly seems to be no evidence, or very little evidence, in the houses on this street that I've noticed of any, I suppose, consistent maintenance regime that would have benefited the occupants of the houses. The idea that you might improve the conditions of your tenants probably didn't really come into the equation very much.
Most of the owners, I suppose, are upper middle class, some of them very wealthy, and I think we have to admit that they were culpable for not addressing the problem.
Badly converted in the first place and neglected thereafter, many of Dublin's tenement houses had deteriorated so much by the start of the 20th century that they could only be described as stinking hellholes.
The biggest problem with a tenement house is that it's designed for one family and their servants. Now, when you have many families living in that house, they still only have one, usually, facility, and that's usually a dry closet in the backyard, where you have to share that with multiple families. You can just imagine how awful it must have been, how filthy.
The foul conditions that existed in houses like this inevitably bred disease. There were regular outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and other deadly contagions throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And the problem didn't stop then. You see, until I looked into the history of the Dublin slums, I naively believed that the dire circumstances which people had to endure 100 years ago in the Dublin Tenements rapidly improved after the War of Independence and the birth of the Irish Free State. Sadly, I found the truth was rather different.
Historian Lindsay Erner Byrne has made a detailed study of a poignant collection of begging letters which working-class Dubliners sent to the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin during the 1920s and 30s. They reveal a level of poverty and desperation fully equal to that which had existed under British rule.
There's about 4,000 letters written in the 20-year period. And my goodness, do they paint a picture. I think more than anything, you get a sense of how eternal the story of poverty is, what the basic hallmarks of poverty are. And that's very tangibly played out. You have people writing as late as 1934, 35, 36 about nakedness. Literally about not having enough clothes to leave the house. A lot of the mothers who wrote would speak directly to the Catholic Archbishop and say, I'm a Catholic mother. I have 5 Catholic souls. If you don't take care of them, the Protestants will. And that was the biggest negotiating tool they had, bargaining with the souls of those children, if you like.
Few people who lived in Dublin during the 1920s and 30s were quite as impoverished as the desperate mothers who threw themselves on the mercy of the Catholic Church. But extreme hardship was commonplace all the same.
At one stage in the early 1930s, a national newspaper in Ireland suggested that governments should be grateful for the boundless resignation of the Dublin poor, that they hadn't revolted, that there hadn't been that sense of street protest, of absolute and utter rejection of the idea that they needed to continue to be subjected to those kind of living conditions.
The terrible poverty of the 1930s is something that Maureen Johnston, a lifelong resident of the South Dublin district known as the Liberties, vividly recalls. She has never forgotten the awful one-room tenement her grandmother found for her mother, her brothers and her after her father died unexpectedly in 1932.
She got us this little small room 2 doors away from where she was living, and there were no floorboards. It was just bare, kind of, it was dirt and filth. Before we got the bed, we had to sleep on the floor, on the stones, the dirt and filth, you know. And I can still feel the things crawling over me, you know.
Lee Dunn wrote a famous book about tenement life called Goodbye to the Hill. His childhood was also overshadowed by poverty and want.
I was one of hundreds, maybe thousands of Dublin children that spent 2 or 3 years in their bare feet. They had no shoes, it's that simple. And there was no money to buy shoes.
Noel Burns grew up in the 1940s, when you might have expected things to have got a little better. But he too had an incredibly difficult time.
Well, I'll tell you about the 40s in Dublin. Everybody was poor, you know. I remember one time now I was that hungry. I was going up to hell and I ate a cut of bread off the ground. I was that hungry, you know. And when I got home, I found a cut of bread on the ground and ate it. When I got home, I came into the house and I got sick that night in the corner. I threw it all up. And sometimes I would eat, at that time, in the 1943 or 4, I'd eat orange skins if I got them. I used to bring them home and clean them and eat them.
A memorable incident during his childhood proved to Lee Dunn that some people were even hungrier than he and his family.
There was somebody came to the door and my mother came in. And she had a loaf and she cut it down the middle. And she took half out of the door. Somebody had no bread at all.
Gnawing hunger blighted many a Dublin tenement dweller's life during the 1930s and 40s. Just as bad as having nothing to eat, though, was the ever-present threat of contracting a fatal disease.
My mother got typhoid fever and her brother died with it. And around about that time, there was a map made by the medical officer of health in Dublin, putting little dots, red dots, where all the houses were, where there was cholera and typhoid and diphtheria, which was a killer in those days. Scarlet fever was a killer. And all those diseases existed up to my time.
Tuberculosis, which stalks through our land. Can we do anything about this?
The biggest killer of all was a terrible lung disease, tuberculosis, or TB.
To fight TB, we medical men must have modern equipment.
I had a friend called Tom McLeod, who's since deceased, my age, and he was 7 years in sanitariums with tuberculosis. Somebody asked me, this is an autobiography, this Goodbye to the Hill. And I said, no, it's a novel. He said, it's got to be autobiography. He said, man, I cried over this, your brother, your younger brother, Larry. I said, well, I've got to tell you, man, you can check my mother. I didn't have a brother, Larry. I didn't have a brother who died of TB. He said, how did you achieve that? And I said, well, because I wrote Larry for all the little fuckers that died around me. TB. And nobody knew their name except their families. That's where Larry came from. And that's a true story. They were down like flies. It was unbelievable. Galloping consumption, it was called. Can you believe that? Galloping consumption. Well, Jays, it must have been galloping, the rate it was killing them.
No one could possibly relish returning to the harsh world of the Dublin tenements, but 7 members of the Winston family are planning to do just that. Spending 3 days and 2 nights in this dank and dusty house was never going to be easy for them, but the level of discomfort that's likely to be involved just went up a notch. With just days to go before the family are due to move in, Dublin has been hit by its heaviest snowfall in years. Going ahead with the plan is going to be a lot harder now than it would have been if the weather had stayed mild, but our volunteers have decided to press on. To make the task a little easier for them, we've asked furniture expert Kevin Cunningham to track down some suitable items to kit out the empty room they'll be moving into soon. Kevin is familiar with the history of the tenements and knows what to look out for. Pieces of furniture that are roughly comparable in terms of quality and comfort to the ones tenement dwellers of 50 to 100 years ago had in their homes. The remarkable photographs from 1913 that we saw earlier on show that many tenements at that time were barely furnished at all. A lot of families had no more than a kitchen table, a saggy old bed, and a few broken down chairs. Some tenement dwellers, though, had quite a bit more.
Some of the people who might be tradesmen and had a good income, although they lived in tenements, they were proud, they liked nice things. A lot of them would have had this type of furniture, not as quite as good as this, but they'd have antiques. And they loved polishing up things and polishing their furniture.
Kevin Cunningham is looking for items that a typical tenement family, one with a middling kind of income, might have owned. Clothing expert Hilary O'Kelly, meanwhile, is touring Dublin's charity shops in search of suitable clothes for our volunteers to wear. She's looking for garments that correspond to those of 50 to 100 years ago, especially in terms of warmth.
Coldness would have been a huge issue. You know, you might hang on to clothes if there was a bit of warmth in them, even if they were out of fashion. You would be warm rather than fashionable or beautifully dressed for preference.
Having found what she regards as suitable clothes for our 7 volunteers to wear, Hilary is showing them to Cathy Winston to make sure she's happy with them too.
I don't know how many you want. This is one I think you might...
Well, there's 4 skirts that we need. Okay, anyway.
The garments get Cathy's seal of approval, and that's just as well because things are coming to a head now, so far as the volunteers are concerned.
I like that. Yeah, that's, I like that.
Kevin Cunningham has tracked down suitable items of furniture to kit out the cramped room they're going to be spending the next 3 days in, and he's moving them in along with some basic household supplies. How will the family members respond to this bare room and its pile of disparate objects when they set up home here in 24 hours' time? In our next programme, we'll find out. And we'll also discover a great deal more. Next time, as the Winstons take up residence in 7 Henrietta Street, they learn, and so do we, about the arduous nature of tenement life.
Those rooms are absolutely, winter time they're like fridges, absolutely freezing.
We find out about the back-breaking labour and cramped conditions that tenement dwellers had to endure.
The generations before us, we had it better than they did. Exactly. So what the hell did they have?
And we gain an insight in particular into the incredible toughness of the lives led by tenement women.
There was 14 of them, plus me nanny and grandad. And me nanny was the one doing all of that work.
And The Tenements continues next week at the slightly later time of 10. Next, we bring you a shocking insight into the gruesome life of Joseph Fritzl. That's after the break.